So only about 3 days ago, we got 4 inches of snow. Seems like winter was here, and now it's Saturday afternoon. It's the mid-60s. We're in the mid-60s, and it's the perfect day to be brewing. So we're out here today making Doogie beer. So Bob, if you are watching this, happy birthday. And we're about to get ready to do our Vorlauf, which is an opportunity for us to rinse out our grains before we bring it into our boil kettle and make sure that any grain particles that are in suspension are pulled out so that we don't get a grainy, hazy, messy boil. So what we have here so far is obviously our tubing with our threaded end that we're going to be putting into the end of our mash tun, which will eventually be draining our liquid into our boil kettle. But more importantly, first off, we have this giant sheet of tin foil that we're going to use for our Vorlauf. There's a lot of different ways you can Vorlauf simply by running off some liquid and recirculating it in. But if you do that, you have to be very careful when you're pouring the liquid back in that you don't disturb your grain bed and thus cause a stuck sparge or a stuck drain. So what I like to use, like I said, is this giant sheet of tin foil. I've poked about 100 little holes into it. And what will ultimately happen when we get to it is I'll pour the Vorlauf liquid back over the tin foil, and it will slowly dispense back into the grain bed, leaving the grain that we've taken out of the mash kettle behind on top of the sheet, and letting the liquid that we've run off filter back into our bed. By doing this a couple of times, we're going to get a very nice clear wort that'll drain off into our kettle before we move on to the actual boil. So let's get started. Alright, so we're set up. We have our tubing set up onto our mash tun, and I just have this small little plastic container here that I'm going to use to collect the runnings during the Vorlauf. So I'm going to put the tubing into my little container and just open up the valve on the mash tun just a little bit to get it to start running. Now you can't see it quite yet, but while the liquid is very light, again this is a whip beer we're making, there's a lot of grain. Ah, there goes there's a lot of grain being collected in the liquid. I'm going to open up the valve just a little bit more, get a little stronger pour going. Shut it off right about there. And even just through that first little bit of runnings, the clarity of the liquid coming out of the tube and out of the mash tun is much clearer. A lot less grain is already going. So what's ultimately happening is the grain that's in there that's been stirred around and is sitting in all this liquid is starting to settle. It's starting to fall down and become compact. And once it compacts completely, it'll be very hard for the liquid to pull it through the valve in the kettle screen and into our boil kettle. So what I'm going to do next is take this first set of runnings, and I'm going to recirculate it back into the mash tun. Alright, so we're ready to start recirculating. I'm going to open up our mash tun really quick, get a nice look at our mash. And simply what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my piece of tin foil, place it on top of the bed. I'm going to take the circulated runnings. I don't know if you can see on there, but you can see the grain that's kind of floating in suspension here. I'm going to slowly pour this over the top of the tin foil. Now if I was doing this, and you can do this without the tin foil, but if you're doing without the tin foil, you have to pour a lot slower, trying to get down closer to the grain as to not disturb it too much. Alright, so there's our first circulation. It'll continue to slowly filter back into the grain bed, and I'm going to go and do this one more time just to be safe and make sure our beer is as clear as possible. So we're just doing one more quick running of some liquid here. Depending on the beer, depending on the grain, depending on how you mash, a lot of different factors. You'll probably have to do this, 2 to 4, maybe 5 times at most to really get your beer to be nice and cleared up. But again, it certainly is worth the effort to go through a Vorlauf each time, both when you're doing your first runnings and after you sparge, in order to get beer that is clear as possible, and so that you don't deal with a boil that is full of grainy mess. Nobody wants that in their beer, and it certainly doesn't help with clarification purposes. Not to mention, if there's grain in suspension during your boil, it could scorch and give you some off flavors. It's highly unlikely, but it is certainly a possibility. So after doing this Vorlauf, you can see the last of this liquid being very clear. No grain is really coming out of even the container at this point. So we successfully set the grain bed, made it so the grain's not going to pull through as we collect our runnings. And with that being the case, we're ready to open up the mash tun and start collecting our wort.